Greetings. My name is Timothy Snyder. I'm the Levin Professor of History at Yale University. I am greeting and welcoming you this evening on behalf of the Franke program, which has enabled me, along with my colleague, Professor Jason Stanley, to teach a seminar this semester on mass incarceration in the Soviet Union and the United States. This is the last of these lectures that I'll be introducing, so I want to make a special point of thanking Richard and Barbara Franke for their support of the humanities in particular at Yale. This is much appreciated in general. In particular, I've been very glad to be able to teach this class. So this class, this seminar on mass incarceration in the USSR and the US is getting towards its middle point. At this point, our students have spent a couple of weeks reading about the origins of the Gulag and the functioning of the Gulag. This week, you who are not our students are joining us as we move on to the subject of the experience of the Gulag. One of the most important chroniclers of the Soviet camps was a Polish artist whose name was Józef Czapski. Józef Czapski is what I should say was, until a few years ago, someone who was idolized by, I would say, the best part of the Polish intelligentsia. Thanks to our speaker this evening, Eric Karpeles, Józef Czapski has moved from being someone who was known to a few as an outstanding painter and chronicler of the 20th century to become a figure who can be now and is becoming now much more widely known. I'm a historian, and I've always understood Józef Czapski in terms of his experiences, but Eric Karpeles, who is himself an artist and a translator, as well as a writer, someone who found Czapski by way of Proust, which is an extraordinary connection. When Czapski was in a Soviet camp, he was allowed to give French lessons, and he did so in the form of recapitulating remembrance of things past by Proust, which is, for me, one of the most extraordinary civilizational achievements imaginable, and deep and profound in all kinds of ways. But Eric Karpeles came to Czapski from a different direction. He came to Czapski by way of Proust and by way of art, and discovered or rediscovered him as a painter, and then has contributed, in fact, essentially all by himself, has created a revival of Józef Czapski in the West, in the English language, by retranslating the lecture notes that Czapski gave about Proust in the Soviet camp, by compiling the art into an extraordinarily beautiful volume, which I'm going to bring to class tomorrow, and by writing an accessible, and even for me, who thought he knew the life pretty well, a striking and original and persuasive biography of Czapski called Almost Nothing, which I'm going to do my duty and hold up now. People speak of dog-eared copies as though it's a cliche, but this, you can see that this is actually a dog-eared copy. So at this point in the class, we're very very happy to be able to welcome Eric Karpeles. We're trying to consider what it would be like to experience and think about and see the Gulag. And Józef Czapski there could be no better figure than Józef Czapski for that. But more than that, the class needs to reach a point where we understand that the people who experience the Gulag are experiencing it thoughtfully by way of other things they bring to it, that their lives are not just determined by this experience of incarceration. Józef Czapski is an example of someone for whom incarceration was very important for himself, but perhaps more so for his friends and his comrades and his colleagues who he later tried to remember. But he was above all an artist who lived an almost century-long life. So I'm very pleased that at this point in the class, we're going to be able to seriously introduce art as part of the history or part of the approach to mass incarceration. This is a theme and an approach alongside philosophy and history, which I hope will be able to keep going. So there's no one better to do this for us than Eric Karpeles. Eric, I'm very glad that you were able to join us. I welcome you on behalf of all the people who can see you, but whom you can't see. And I'm very much looking forward to your lecture and to your presentation. Thank you.
It's certainly an honor to see a copy of my book read by you with those dog-eared pages. It makes a great impression upon me. I will say that right now I need to see how. So Józef Czapski, Facing the Void. I have chosen the title as a way of expressing the context of this class and the way in which Czapski can interact with the subject at large. Facing the Void is in one way of looking at the world, the 20th century, which Czapski lived through. He lived into his 97th year. And also a way of the internal life of Czapski, in which he always felt the need to create as a way of filling the void, as a way of making comment on the world around him. Czapski was an enormously large character. He will fit very tightly, be shoehorned into this short lecture of mine, which could actually warrant an entire semester of study. So without a lot of further ado, I'm just going to jump in. I've been asked by Professor Snyder to put him in a context of the world in which the class takes place, and also to speak about him as an artist, which I feel more comfortable in, but I will run you through all of this. So we're going to begin with, this is the world in which Czapski was born in 1896. It's a map of Central and Eastern Europe and Russia, and it rightly suggests the very specific and firm international imperial borders, but it fails to note that beyond these borders, cultural and societal norms were transgressed, that this was not something that stopped at a border, that these societies all interacted with each other. Czapski's family was just outside of Minsk, where their lands were, and this is in what today is known as Belarus. The home in which Czapski grew up, his childhood home. Here he is with his parents on the left and his 5 sisters and 1 brother. His mother was an Austrian countess and his father was a Polish count who grew up speaking French and German and Russian, but who only learned Polish at university. This was a world peopled by highly cosmopolitan individuals, citizens of the world rather than people defined by a single national identity. Czapski had Russian, Baltic, Czech, and German cousins. He was born in Prague in 1896 in one of his mother's family's palaces. It was a great life of privilege. It was his mother, the Austrian countess, however, who decided that her children should be raised as what she liked to call her little Poles. When he turned 13, Czapski and his younger brother were shipped off to St. Petersburg to improve their Russian, with the expectation that their time would come to run the family estate and to prepare for the baccalaureate. 5 years later, in 1914, the First World War was systematically destroying the old life of Europe, slaughtering a generation of young men. Czapski, still in Petersburg and deeply immersed in Tolstoyan spiritualism, he was very young and he was very vulnerable. And Tolstoy meant a great deal to him, and he wrestled with his feelings about religion, about God, but to keep them from being sent to the front as war fodder, Czapski's father enrolled his 2 boys in the elite military training school, the Corps de Page in St. Petersburg. This self-portrait, which was drawn at the time, was the first of a long line of self-portraits. Czapski presented himself as a military cadet and a young man of the world. He was still in Petersburg when both the February and October revolutions erupted in 1917, and he was deeply marked by the experience. He returned to Warsaw in 1918 and decided to pursue a course of study in painting rather than to continue on with his training as a pianist. In February of 1919, tensions exploded between the newly minted Second Republic of Poland and Soviet Russia, not yet the Soviet Union. Abandoning his course of study at the Fine Arts Academy in Warsaw, Czapski volunteered immediately for military service. His courage in combat earned him the Polish Order of the Virtuti Militari, the country's highest military decoration. He received this medal at the same time as a French officer who had become a friend of his, Charles de Gaulle, who had been sent to Poland as an observer. The friendship survived over the decades to come. Back from the front, he enrolled at the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow, a city where he knew no one. Czapski would recall, "I entered the world of my new friends, where an intellectual atmosphere, marked by a carefree assurance, a winning optimism, and a sensual joie de vivre, was totally alien to me." Czapski, as you can see in this picture, grew to enormous heights. He was 6 feet, 6 inches tall. Everyone, however, knew him as Yusuf, which is an affectionate diminutive of the name Yusuf. It's one of those contradictions that Czapski's life is full of, but largely it's the sense of the scale of him that's so impressive always. As a painting student, he was caught between the historical religious requirements of the traditional Polish painting, and at the same time, what was going on in Warsaw was the fashionable leaning towards post-Cubist ideological movements like Futurism and Formism. Neither of these poles was particularly appealing to him as a painter, as a painting student, and he and a group of like-minded students bonded together. They raised money hoping they could finance a trip to spend 6 weeks in Paris, where all the action was in painting. They felt they were in a backwater. They recognized that and hoped to move on. They gave a ball to raise money. They did all sorts of fundraising things, and they raised enough money to spend 6 weeks in Paris. They succeeded and departed for Paris, but instead of staying 6 weeks, they stayed 7 years. They became known as the Committee of Paris, and ever after their return to Poland, they were known as the Kapists. Czapski's 7 years in Paris were enormously important. They were marked by his immersion in the painting of Bonnard and Matisse. The group's attending professor, the painter Józef Czapski, who's shown in a self-portrait on the bottom left of the screen, was an old friend of Bonnard. The two of them used to go to the south together every summer and paint side by side. It was a time in which he shared with his sister Maria, who became enormously important to him, and the two of them were together for most of their lives, their long lives. She was also as tall as he. She was very striking. She became an historian. Eventually, the Polish painters had the excitement of their own first exhibition, which gained them praise from such recognized figures as Dufy, Rouault, and even Bonnard himself. Czapski was able to sell his first paintings, including one to Gertrude Stein. On the right, you see the image of what's called the Impasse de Rouet, which is that building was where the painters communally met every day to work in studio space. There were many influences on Czapski at the time. He had come to Paris to see the real painting going on. And in the following groups of slides, I've shown on the left a known painter and Czapski's work that somehow shows the influence and the effect of coming in contact with this kind of painting. Here's Cézanne. The fellow on the right, the portrait is of a man named Gilles Aronson, who was an art critic that Czapski knew. Here's Matisse on the left. And on the right, we see Czapski's closest attempt at fauvism. This is a way in which you see the influence of technique, of color, of form, learning from the masters. Soutine, Czapski on the right. Czapski on the left in this case. You can see him painting with a certain crude stroke, and yet with a great amount of animation, of vitality, and of an interest in color. Bonnard was a terrific influence on Czapski. These works on paper with pencil and watercolor and colored pencil, but primarily in the intensity of the color in his canvases. In 1930, after having mounted the group exhibition at the Galerie Zach, Czapski headed to Spain for 6 weeks. In the vast halls of the Prado, he had what he called the shock of my life. Standing before the huge array of works by Goya, he was overwhelmed. His masterful portraits of great ladies, dignitaries, cardinals, and kings are painted so smoothly to the degree that you don't feel the brush. They're classical in composition and miraculous in the control of every detail, Czapski wrote, and in the materiality of the object, in the consideration given to local colors, in the gradation of values. Next to these portraits, in another room, hung badly, were paintings by Goya so extremely different that it was difficult to believe they were painted by the same person. War scenes, wild scenes with witches, so frenzied we see all the brushstrokes. Color contrasts are as violent, they rival Soutine, and a disdain for local color and the object's materiality, such that the canvases sometimes give the impression of almost abstract color relations. Speaking of myself, Czapski went on, I was long tormented by a duality of approach. Analytic on the one hand, rational, growing from the Dutch tradition, and on the other hand, the mad, the unpredictable, the true leap into the abyss. In this, I saw a lack of integrated personality in myself, a kind of psychic dividedness that I tried to overcome artificially without success. But then I noticed the same phenomena in a painter whose stature was not only equal to that of Matisse, but who was one of the very greatest. I speak about Goya. By 1931, excuse me, by 1931, the group of Polish painters had returned to Poland. Czapski set up a studio in Warsaw and entered directly into the flow of the artistic scene there. He began to write about painting as well and to exhibit his work on a yearly basis. We find in his work from these years the seed of the French style transplanted into Polish soil, taking root, bearing fruit. Yet these paintings tend to conform to a range of stylistic options that feel imposed from without, tried on like various guises, rather than emanating from somewhere within. Strengthened by Goya's example, Czapski is nevertheless still finding his way, learning as he goes. These paintings were done at a time when the Bloomsbury group painters were actually very closely experimenting in the same way with changing old painting styles. Here's Czapski coming down the hallway. You can see that yellow bar about a third of the way up from the bottom of the canvas, across the canvas, which is not quite opaque, in which you can see the turn of the carpet coming towards you down the hall. Czapski is still learning his medium here. In the mid-1930s, Czapski met a young writer named Ludwig Hering. In their own tortured way, they overcame their constraining religious scruples and allowed themselves to fall in love, to set up home as far as was possible in so repressive an environment. Knowledge of this unconventional setup, of what was perceived as their flaunting of societal norms, is what has continued to this day to mute the response of the community in Poland to Czapski's achievements and his indisputable historical significance. The two men had several heartening, emotional, nurturing years together and remained in close spiritual contact until the death of Herring, who, ill with cancer, committed suicide in 1984. This is one of Czapski's paintings just before war broke out, 1937. This is the promenade at Sopot on the Baltic Sea, just outside of what was then known as Danzig. You can see the Nazi flags along the promenade. On September 1st, Poland was invaded by Germany in the air, on the ground, the sea. On September 2nd, the next day, Czapski went to join his cavalry regiment as a reserve officer, aged 43. On the 27th of September, he and his regiment were surrounded by Germans outside of Lvov. Surprisingly, they were handed over to the Russian forces, who had invaded Poland from the east on the 16th. He spent 6 months at Starobielsk in Ukraine as a prisoner of war in a camp with, at first, 11,000 fellow prisoners under severe conditions of crowding and lack of food in the first months. In June 1940, he was finally transferred with very few other of his prisoner colleagues to a camp at Gryazowiec, north of Moscow. Here's a self-portrait he made in the camp at Gryazowiec. This is the beginning of our understanding of Czapski and his relationship to drawing and to his journals. He kept a journal throughout the war, which became a source of much of his writing and of his memory of the experience. In the book by Julius Margolin that you're also reading for this class, he says that no one in the camps, no one retains his original form. Observation is difficult because the observer himself is deformed. This was a test that Czapski had set himself, an attempt not to become deformed, to remain true to himself and to help his fellow prisoners also keep focused and keep true to themselves. They were constantly bombarded by Soviet propaganda over loudspeakers in the camp, but they struggled to keep true to themselves. Czapski's war was not the same, certainly as Margolin's. There were different territories and different demands upon each of them, but there was something about Czapski's resistance to the hammering of Soviet propaganda that was very inspiring. So in Russia, paper was enormously valuable. It was not of good quality, but it was very rare and hard to come by. He did whatever he could to get notebooks, and he filled them. This is a drawing of one of his friends in the camp, a man named Adam Mashinsky. This is a drawing on both sides of one piece of paper. I'm showing both sides of it. He filled every page he could and got pencils as he could and materials as he could. But painting was out of the question, really. Drawing and use of watercolors was what he had at hand, and he made the best of it. More drawings of prison companions. He wrote that the sense of being totally unsure if we would ever see anything again in our lives apart from barbed wire, fences, and this alien, hostile world. The sense of being buried alive was cruel. It seemed very unlikely that we would ever get beyond the wire, unless to get a bullet in the back of the head. Professor Snyder made reference to the French lessons that Czapski was able to give. This is his French notebook for those lectures that he gave. He decided to, like Scheherazade, every night tell a little bit of the portion of Proust's great novel, à la recherche de temps perdu, in search of lost time. He took extensive notes, which are in themselves quite beautiful drawings. If you know Proust, you can see a little bit on the left some of the names of the characters. But the sketch itself, the diagram in which he unfolds Czapski like a cosmology, is made in both Polish and French and German and the Russian, different pages carrying different diagrams. This was an understanding for Czapski of the attempt to remember what he had read. He read Proust in the 20s when he was in Paris as each of the volumes came out. He was in a Soviet camp where he had no books, no access to the material. So in order to speak about Proust, he had to remember Proust. And this is, in a way, a kind of manifestation of the very Proustian enterprise, the attempt to recall the past and to make use of it in the present. He wrote that intellectual effort, when conducted without books or notes, gives an entirely different sensation than when carried out under normal conditions. One's involuntary memory acts much more forcefully, the memory of which Proust speaks, and which he considered to be the sole source of literary creation. After a certain amount of time, things surface in our consciousnesses. Details we haven't the slightest idea were even stored anywhere in our brain. What is more, these memories that arise from our subconscious are more deeply rooted, more intimately bound up with one another, more personal. Czapski helped his fellow prisoners to, again, nurture themselves, their interior lives, and to use this experience of sharing Proust as a way of hardening them against the realities outside and nurturing their inner lives. On June 22nd, 1941, everything was upended. To this day, Czapski wrote, I can still hear ringing in my ears a scruffy colonel bending his upper body from the window shouting, Hitler, attack Russia! A new phase of the war began. Stalin provisionally agreed to free all Polish prisoners and deportees in order to form an independent Polish army within the Red Army to fight their former ally, now their common enemy. General Vladislav Anders, confined in Moscow's notorious Lubyanka prison, where he had been tortured and spent 27 months in solitary, had been chosen to command the new Polish order. He had no shoes, he walked slowly from wounds inflicted by beatings, and he wore a prison uniform. On that day, he was introduced to two of Russia's most powerful Politburo members, Merkulov and Beria, who escorted him to a limousine where he was whisked to meetings about the formation of a new Polish division of the Red Army. Soldier prisoners began to gather from all the vast corners of the Gulag to join the new Polish division. But most of the officers never reappeared. Czapski was assigned to interrogate the new arrivals, to investigate what had become of their officers, but thousands of rank-and-file soldiers passed by his desk and produced not one link to the whereabouts of a single officer. Anders then ordered Czapski to find them, arming him with letters of introduction from the commander of the Polish army. For months, he traveled about across the Soviet Union in search of news of these men. But over and over again, he ran straight into a wall of silence. In the meantime, Stalin was determined to send these new Polish recruits to the front. But the men, poorly fed, inadequately armed, and unable to train for combat, having just been released from a year and a half of deprivation and squalor. Anders resisted Stalin's pressure and insisted the men be suitably recovered and trained for the current conditions of war. By order of Anders, Czapski was named Chief Officer of Information and Propaganda for the Polish Army, and he had the considerable distinction of being in daily contact with Anders, his commander-in-chief. When it became clear that a standoff had happened, in the spring of 1942, Stalin agreed to let the Polish troops evacuate to Iran, where they would be fed by British rations, and then move on to Iraq. This map shows the routes taken by the Anders army and by Czapski from his capture in September 1939 over the course of the next 5.5 years. This is an enormous undertaking to move all of these men. Throughout the war, Czapski continued to keep his journal, making elaborate notes, drawing people and scenes he witnessed. On the left is an album from these years in the Middle East. Granichny means borderlands. Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, all of the places that the Polish army had been stationed before its exodus. On the right, his journal once they arrived in Egypt. One night in Tashkent, he was invited to a literary gathering where he encountered the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, whose poems Czapski knew well. At this time, her poetry was revered by many, but officially reviled, considered decadent and bourgeois by the reigning authorities on aesthetic taste. Her work was banned by the regime, and she could no longer publish. Czapski was surprised to find her, widow of a poet murdered by the state, sitting quietly, if aloof, in a Soviet officer's private home. Czapski was asked to read some Polish poetry, which he then translated into Russian. He saw Akhmatova listening intently, tears in her eyes. He gently persuaded her to share some of her poems. Czapski learned that Stalin himself admired some of Akhmatova's work, and it was he personally who ensured her safety. In the presence of this elegant, strong woman with her sharp, alert mind, Czapski found evidence of nearly schizophrenic atmosphere imposed on the closed society of Russian artists. Czapski was the first non-Russian Akhmatova had met in over 20 years. That night, they walked together, late at night, after dinner, and stayed up until dawn, speaking. Years later, Czapski learned that she had written a poem about that night, about the impact of his presence upon her. They met once more in 1965, as she was returning from receiving a doctorate at Oxford on her way back to Russia. She had ditched her followers, her Soviet escort, and gone directly to Paris and saw him. Czapski was in Iraq on April 13th, 1943, when Radio Berlin broadcast the news of the discovery of mass graves in a forest in Western Russia. These were some of the men. I'm still bringing Czapski through the Middle East here. Drawing as he goes, documenting his trip. Aspects of travel, aspect of daily life, and an army full of men at repose, playing soccer, bathing, showering. These are some of the men Czapski had been devoted to finding. Among them, many close friends. The broadcast from Radio Berlin had announced the graves. This is what was dug up. These were scenes of outside of Katyn in the forest of the bodies of Polish officers who were still in their greatcoats, shot in the back of the head. Forever after, for the next 50 years, Czapski would make it his duty to remind the world of the fate of 22,000 of these Polish officers and civilians. The Polish army pushed on out of the Middle East to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, eventually to Cairo and Port Said, where they boarded ships for the Italian peninsula. Czapski was at Anders' side during the planning for the assault on Germans who had dug in for months at the monastery at Monte Cassino, ceaselessly bombed by the Allies in hopes of dislodging them and opening the road to Rome. You can see in the picture on the bottom the ghostly remains of the monastery, which had once been such a beautiful retreat. The Poles, in their first foray at soldiering since leaving the Soviet Union, fought valiantly and at a great loss of life, but succeeded in uprooting the Germans. On the morning of May 18th, the monastery was theirs. Czapski had few illusions about the Allies, for whom the big news that season was the invasion of Normandy and the liberation of Paris. From the Poles, still traumatized by the discovery of the Katyn massacre, the most important event of the late spring of 1944 was the Warsaw Uprising. Czapski's sister Maria had remained in Warsaw through the methodical destruction of most of the city by Nazi troops. As Czapski feared, all of his work that he had stored away before leaving to join his regiment in September 1939, his paintings, his writings, his diaries, was destroyed, along with so much else. His sense of unease about the Allies proved well justified. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Stalin solidified his iron grip on Poland. Still in Rome with the Anders army, Czapski published a memoir of his prison experiences, Memories of Starobielsk, drawn from his daily journal, attended to throughout his years as a soldier. A friend who had been a prisoner in the labor camp in Siberia at the same time described Czapski's account of life as a prisoner as lived by a Pole, meditated on by a European, written by a painter. The book was printed and circulated just as the war ended and was largely ignored or met with hostility by both Soviets and Allies. As the army of Anders broke up in Rome in 1945, Czapski and a group of his like-minded friends determined that they would create an institute called the Polish Literary Institute. They decided to base it in Paris. They put their funds together and came up with a home, not this one, this is the second home, but outside of Paris in a quiet suburb called Maison Lafitte. And this house, which is almost iconic in Russian cultural history, still stands today, is still the home of the Polish Literary Institute. Czapski took up residence in this upper floor in this room with the open window at the back of the house. It was to be his library, his salon, and his painting studio for the next 50 years. All of the work we see from here on will have come out from this little room. Men like Jerzy Gieders, who's shown here with Czapski, Zygmunt and Zosha Herz, Gustav Herling, these and others, after months and months of conversations as soldiers in the Anders army, created the Institute once the army was disbanded. They invested no faith in the redemptive powers of the West. They fully understood the corrosive shadow cast at Yalta. Czapski and Giedrich and a handful of other dedicated souls created from nothing the magazine Kultura, one of the most influential and widely read journals of the 20th century. Kultura had an astonishing run of 637 issues, spanning a 53-year window of time. Looking back, Kultura was synonymous with Poland itself, acting in loco parentis for the Polish institutions denied the right to exist on the ground in Poland itself. The first issue, shown on the left here, included works by Lorca, Paul Valéry, Arthur Koestler. Czapski debuted with a tribute to Bonnard, who had recently died. Czapski was torn between his cosmopolitan self and the Polish roll of events the war foisted on him. He only reluctantly embraced a nationalism that ran counter to his instinctual bohemianism. But he overcame that resistance, and in his creative response to it, he wrote the memoir called Inhuman Land. Some of you've read some of these pages for this class. Czapski said that I was not free to write what I wanted, but I needed to write what I must. His difficulties in getting Inhuman Land published reflect the state of the French left's tenacious romance with Stalinism. Failing to find a publisher, Czapski's book was excerpted in the second and third issues of Kultura. Only 2 years later, in 1949, his old friend Daniel Alevi finally found a publisher willing to print the entire book, if someone else paid for the cost of publication. Despite encouragement from Arthur Koestler and George Orwell, no English publisher would touch it. David Rousseau was a left-wing French journalist and authority on Nazi concentration camps, a survivor of Buchenwald and Neuengamme. His expose of those worlds, called The Truth About the Camps, had been well received. Yet a review of Rousseau's book by art critic and editor Pierre Dex claimed that he was slandering the Soviet Union and was making false claims against it. Rousseau sued for libel. At the trial, Czapski appeared as a witness, answering questions about his years in Starobielsk. The lawyers for Dext tried to undermine his credibility as a witness. Going further and holding forth about the murders of his fellow Poles at Katyn, Czapski stunned the courtroom, enraging the defense team and unleashing an uproar. The judge was forced to call a recess. Czapski's sphere of influence was considerable. As he settled into Maison Lafitte and a life in Paris, he had access to many key players in the shaping of post-war Europe, political, religious, cultural figures whose doors were open to him and who were largely sympathetic to the fates of the Poles in exile. The sketch Czapski did of de Gaulle, Malraux, Alevi, and Jacques-Émile Blanche, Czapski had met when he was in Paris in the 1920s, and he continued their relationships. Camus he met and became a colleague in publishing. Camus relied on Czapski for translations of his books in Polish, and they had a very close and personal relationship. In 1946, as he began to settle into Paris life, Czapski turned 50. Just as he was about to settle into a routine of painting, getting a discipline back, Giedrich imposed upon him to go abroad and to raise money for Kultura. So he once again put aside his brushes and traveled to South America, to North America, to raise money for the magazine, visiting both large cities and small Polish communities. With him all the time was his sketchbook. He documented all of his trips quite thoroughly. Finally, in the early 1950s, Czapski begins to paint, and to paint in earnest, shifting his priorities to the studio upstairs at the back of the house in Maison Lafitte. Here is characteristic a scene that caught Czapski's eye and imagination. What is it that makes it worthy of being a painting? Czapski believed that the truth of everyday life and the truth of art were interchangeable. Unlike the generations of Polish religious and historical painters who constructed heightened costume dramas, he preferred to find humbler subjects close at hand. For Czapski, people waiting for a train were capable of revealing as much about the metaphysics of being as any annunciation or resurrection. He did not go out in search of subjects. They appeared to him as he went about living his life, always alert to the possible combination of elements that might cohere into a memorable image in his mind's eye. The scientist for whom this metro stop was named, Louis Pasteur, once proclaimed about research, "In the field of observation, chance favors the prepared mind." Czapski had such a mind. Czapski declared that the precision of the eye, not the precision of the hand, is the first and most important task. This is a variation on the saying of Turner, "Paint what you see, not what you know." The result was often a canvas that, in Czapski's own words, could set one's teeth on edge, with a subject that could as often as not be revolting. He took his strength from Goya. He noted that a great many criticized me for painting the filthy steps of the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris. He considered Woman in Front of a Train to be his masterpiece, although that changed from time to time. Old women had a particular fascination for him, and he admired their tactics of survival. Here, the woman is a cipher. She clearly has had her share of woe. This picture belongs to the genre of vanitas paintings, in which a painter addresses the transiency of life, the certainty of death, and the folly of pleasurable pursuits. That hat, that handbag, those shoes. The fire in the painting is banked low, an orange glow at the bottom of the train, evoking a sense of embers burning steadily inside of her, subdued, well beyond the flames of youth. It's something of a tribute to Czapski's iconoclasm to try to call up another painter who draws from both Goya and Matisse in the same painting. Here you can see these shoes that Matisse has buckled on the left, kind of echoed on the right. So Czapski had within this one canvas a combination of influences and yet his own inimitable style. By the late 50s, he was exhibiting regularly in Europe. Here he is in Paris in 1959, meeting for the first time the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert. You can see the paintings scattered around the room on the wall. And you can see also the figure of the man, how tall he is. He towers over Herbert, and how thin he is. I'll go through now a series of paintings from this time. These subjects range from still lives to interior scenes. You can imagine Czapski coming out of the door of an apartment onto the landing and looking down and seeing this. He sketched it in his diary, made several versions of it, and this is the final painting. There's something about the headlessness of the figure that is curious and became something of a trope in his work. Again, one wonders what prompts Czapski to capture an image many of us might otherwise have turned away from. He claimed that in Proust, we come across an absolute absence of bias, a willingness to know and understand as many opposing states of the human soul as possible, a capacity for discovering, in the lowest of man, such nobility as to appear sublime, and in the seemingly purest of beings, the basest instincts. Czapski shares this breadth of curiosity and fascination. A sequence of entries from the pages of his diary. I bought a whole bunch of lilies. Sometimes my own vision, which being ravished is intensified, almost forcing itself on me, frees me, unifies me internally. But for that to happen, I need access to deeper waters to counter the flow of the ravishment. These waters, I haven't got them. How often does this ravishment prove a sterile ground, a cause of failure and a backing down? I wait, not having the power in me to make this leap forward. to attack the canvas. I want to paint the lilies in a very modest picture, to apply in a single go, some perfect juxtapositions, a brown, a velvety red, the green of the leaves, the white of the flower. All of that is so beautiful, it stops me. Czapski was always a painter of doubt. He doubted his own abilities, and he doubted what he was able to produce and whether or not it had value. He was very hard on himself, and yet this struggle, this internal struggle, urged him on. He had an enormous furnace with him and burning with a desire to remove the vision from within him and put it onto the page. Painting of his sister Ruja. He did portraits. He had people sit for him to keep his discipline, his hand. He disliked formal commissioned portraiture, but he did it knowing that it could bring positive results in terms of commissioned work or sales. Here are two formal portraits he did, one of Herbert and the other of the Portuguese writer Ferrata Morda. The fascination with the hands of the writers is, to me, of great interest. This is a self-portrait in which Czapski looks out at us circumspectly, not quite open-faced, but present, pensive. About his truncated eyeglasses, he's unflustered, suggesting, "My glasses are broken? Well, yes, okay, it's not a big deal." The picture he's looking out of is shown at the easel on the right. Everything appears rather matter of fact, but a light bulb is floating, swimming, like a Monet water lily in a lake of luminous effects behind his head. Is the subject of the painting the painter's head, or the bulb, or the space between them? There seems to be an acknowledgement of shared territory, of fullness and of emptiness, of being and nothingness, existing together at once, side by side, neither one state nor the other prevailing. The atmosphere of the painting, filled by almost ecstatic brushstrokes, put down with great effervescence, raises existential questions after the fashion of Beckett and Giacometti, both of whom exerted powerful influences on Czapski at this time. He was able to catch psychological states, often pulling out of the sitter something that perhaps they didn't mean to reveal. The painting on the right is one of the first examples that would become a genre for Czapski of painting people looking at paintings. Somehow he became so involved with the work that he was at museums, he would go to galleries, and not only the work itself, but the engagement of the people with the work of art became significant to him and became a subject of many works. Here, a young man stands in front of an abstract painting by Nicolas Destal. It is an example of his attempt to reconcile non-representational abstraction with his own work, putting an abstract painting into a painting of a figure so that you get both. This is a time in Paris where abstraction, non-representational abstraction became almost de rigueur. And Czapski resisted it for many reasons. For as long as he could, he tried to understand it, but he was not drawn to it. Here are his sketches of people looking at works that he did in museums and galleries throughout Paris. His books were filled with such drawings. Here in the center is a self-portrait of him as an older man looking at a painting. The awareness of himself and others as they engaged with works of art. This painting was done after visiting a Courbet retrospective at the Grand Palais. Czapski gets the opportunity to paint not only what he sees, but to paint the Courbets as well, and to reduce them to a certain kind of essence of vision. The technique of brushing so loosely in this was at a time when the same free immersion in what might be called abstract expressionist technique was happening in New York. Painters like Philip Guston and Grace Hartigan embodied the use of that technique with narrative paintings that is very close to Czapski's heart. He did not know their work. Here's an example, a detail of the way that paint was put down. Every brushstroke, you must remember, requires a decision. Vision, Czapski wrote, is a shock, where willful choice between this or that is powerless. A miracle of beauty which one alone can see, unique, fleeting, imperceptible, or even held up to ridicule by others. Very characteristic choice of subject matter, the sense of presence and absence, the hope of transcendence, and the spark of those yellows and orange dabs of paint. In 1980, Czapski turned 84. He continued to work, attacking the canvas with more gusto and buoyant energy. Painting was a necessity for him, an essential as breathing and thinking. His eyesight began to diminish erratically, but his appetite for work was unquenchable. As was true for Monet and Degas, encroaching blindness spurred him on to new depths of seeing. He kept his tubes of paint in envelopes with the name of the color scrawled in his large hand to facilitate identification as he worked. In his book, Late Style, the critic Edward Said wrote, "Late style is what happens if art does not abdicate its rights in favor of reality." The paintings Czapski made in his final years reveal a harnessing of his vision and a clarity of purpose few can match. In a time of physical decline, he was somehow gaining momentum. He persisted in his quixotic fashion. Each canvas was a testimony and a victory. When his beloved Sister Maria died, he wrote in his diary, "Before I die, I would like to have a time of painting in the high heat of work." He did have his time, and he worked it for all it was worth. He began a series of landscape paintings in the early 80s as his eyesight was beginning to wane. In this canvas called Cloudburst, a trembling sky holds a gathering of meteorological factors, a highly dramatic, almost operatic scene. Pure atmosphere has been triggered to change. The sky is vaporous, animated, insubstantial. A puffball of cloud hovers, sparking a kind of enchantment, like a Shakespearean sprite. Something magical emerges. Czapski wrote to a friend, "What's surprising is that I'm still painting. Each time I start a canvas, I have the feeling that I'm fooling the audience, since I can see almost nothing." The touch of Czapski's brush is fearless, whipping across the canvas like the wind blowing over a field. Diminished eyesight freed him from a certain tyranny of form. It's as though he is letting his brush do the seeing, loading it up with color. He lets it play across the canvas, seeming to show him what it is he's seeing as it moves along. Several of the landscapes do verge on pastoral cliché, but his response to what he sees is always free and unencumbered. The paintings seem to inhale vision and exhale color. Czapski looked out on a moral universe. He was never indifferent to what he saw. Trees and fields spoke their truth to him, revealing in a way you could be in the world, beyond the storied failings of men. He spent his summers in the Ile-de-France walking every day, sketchbook in hand, striding out among the open farmland and rolling hills. The landscapes he painted in these years present an allegorical marriage of the bucolic and the impenetrable, embodying an almost biblical tension between innocence and knowledge. The process was referred to by the critic William Epsom as putting the complex into the simple. These works are unself-conscious in a new way, poetic, empathic, pure. Here's Czapski in his room with the self-portrait done. You'll see on the far right side of the photograph, the lower shelf has stacks of books leaning up one against each other. These are his diaries that he always kept at hand. He slept in the bed he's sitting on now with his head to the wall, and every morning he would reach up and grab at random one of those journal volumes. He would read what he had written at some point in the past, and he would often annotate his response to what he had read, and then find the latest journal and begin his day afresh with new musings. In 1981, martial law was declared in Poland. Solidarity was banned, and many of its leaders were jailed. A black and white photograph of 5 prisoners walking on a routine exercise break under a makeshift netting of prison security was smuggled out of Poland and made the rounds, distributed to the world's press. Czapski was moved to make a painting of something he had not seen with his own eyes. He had left Krakow for Paris in 1924 to sever all relations with the overblown style of historical painting, but here he made one of his own, limiting his palette to the mixture of black and white. Draining all color out of the image also hinted at the Western European idea of life in a Soviet satellite nation. A dismal prospect, bleak, dystopian. The figures appear weary and vulnerable. For 40 years, this painting hung in the hallway leading to Czapski's room in Maison Lafitte. I like to think of this late canvas as a companion piece to Titian's great late painting, The Flaying of Marsyas, full of emotional strength, exuding negative capability. The narrative elements are all there, but as in Morandi's Quiet Still Lives, the picture is hardly about any of them. The surface is all rough and scumbled. Almost whimsical, the picture also gives us a strong whiff of what the French call peau de chagrin, a kind of progressive awareness of one's mortality. We see the painter's thighs and knees, the tips of his shoes. He's engaged in viewing an exhibit of paintings, each reduced to a crude rectangle with a yellow line around it, indicating a frame. The particular paintings hung on display don't matter any more than the identity of the painter. The painting is a study of Czapski's sacred space, his temple, his place of worship, his attempt to delineate the boundless boundaries of the realm of art, a vast and anonymous expanse of the imagination, greater than any specific work or individual. In the 50s, Czapski had painted a seated soprano singing Tosca's aria, Visi d'arte, I lived for art. Here, 35 years later, he painted himself, as it were, singing the same anthem. He's both audience and performer. The gallery has no fourth wall. One of his latest paintings, done, you can see as his eyesight is really very minimal. There's a detail of it. In an essay called What Abstract Art Means to Me, Willem de Kooning conjectured that art used to be about what one put in a picture. Then the time came when the question was not of what one could paint, but what one could not. He went on to say that Subject matter is the forever mute part of the picture you can talk about forever. Here's Czapski in his room, in his studio, with his desk, with his diaries, with his paintings crammed one up against another. Fearless, going on full bore. Czapski had never understood why he had not suffered the same tragic end of his fellow prisoners. 2 years before his death, a year after the fall of communism, he was informed by a Russian historian in 1991 that a certain Countess Potocka and Count Ferdinand de Destal, who had held sway with the German high command during the war, had interceded to save his life. They convinced the officers that people born in the areas annexed by Nazi Germany fell under the jurisdiction of the Third Reich. Czapski, who was born in Prague, was part of that. Apparently, their influence was strong enough to have the command agree, and they may have added his name to a list of those to be spared. The NKVD received the list from the German embassy on March 5th, 1940, the very day the Politburo signed the order leading to the murder of 22,000 Polish officers. Just a month before the executions began. Czapski didn't recognize either of the two names. Though it may well be true, this report is ultimately unverifiable. So many people wanted to know why Czapski was not among those who had been sacrificed. But in my opinion, appearing on a list of lives to be spared, and a Polish officer and an titled aristocrat to boot, would have seemed more likely to have made the NKVD want to kill him than otherwise. These are Czapski's late journals, bought at an art supply store in Paris, where coincidentally I was also living and bought my supplies at the same time in the 80s and late 70s. A few days before his death, he scribbled in an awkward handwriting of a blind man the words Bonnard, Matisse, Goya, and Proust. And then, in capital letters, across many pages, the word Katyn. Here, on the last pages of his nearly 300 surviving volumes of his lifelong journal, are his final marks. The strokings of a pen on a sheet of paper by a blind man in search of reassurance that making a mark is a valuable activity, that it makes a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for bringing to our audience and to our class a sense of the man and of his work that otherwise would certainly have escaped us. Thank you for bringing to bear so humbly and so persuasively your skills as a historian of art and as an artist. I feel like from this we have what I'd hoped we would have, which is an entirely different angle of view, which is itself about what it means to see, which was Czapski's preoccupation, his lifelong preoccupation. I think I forgot when I introduced you to remind the audience that the way we ask questions is by putting your name, like by using, I think it's someone correct me if necessary, using the question and answer function down below, or by using the chat and writing down questions. So I didn't tell anyone this, so I don't think I have any questions yet, which opens up for me the possibility of abusing the privilege of the chair and asking you the first one. I'm gonna give the students time to think about how they might ask questions related to the class. One thing which is fairly clear in your presentation, although you don't say it outright, is that Czapski got better. He was better in middle age as a painter than he was as a young man. I believe it's fair to say. And then one could even say that as a very old man, he might have been better than he was when he was in middle age. And so I want to ask you if I'm understanding you correctly. I mean, I realize that better than, worse than are not words that artists like reach to with alacrity. But if forgive my primitive way of putting it, I wanted to ask you if I'm understanding you correctly. And I also want to ask you your views about why. Of course, in the context of this class, we're thinking about we're thinking about we're thinking about Soviet camps and incarceration in general and experience. And Czapski does have this, there's this striking fact that he can't really paint for roughly a decade because of the Second World War and the things he felt called upon to do, and that he returns to painting after 10 years, and that he's much more interesting, I think, when he returns to it. That must have something to do with not being able to paint. It must have something to do with the camps. And I guess the riddle would be, or the question I want to put to you directly is, what is your feeling about that relationship? Like, I mean, in some sense, like Czapski as a creator, with a few exceptions, one of which you showed, the 1981 martial law painting, he's not someone who is, except when he is directly rendering something in the camps. He's not a painter who's bringing the camps out into the world, right? So there's not that kind of simple relationship, but there must be some. And I wonder if in all of your thinking about this, you would share with us what you think that relationship might have been.
There are a few questions in there, and I will try, if I can, to answer them in the order they were asked. About whether or not Czapski got better as he did. I feel that Czapski was enormously privileged to be able to live 97 years. He had the arc of a painter that is quite considerable, and he was a slow starter. When he was in Paris, he felt very frustrated because the group of Polish painters around him all made enormous strides, and he felt that he was constantly treading in place and not making progress. By the time he got back to Warsaw, I think he had an increase in confidence in himself. I think some of this is about one's relationship to one's taking on a lifetime of painting and whether or not one is qualified to actually do that. And I think by the time he got back to Warsaw in the 30s, he felt emboldened, and the companion experience of writing about painting, I think, freed up a certain part of the vision in him, because he could talk about it and almost extract it from his mind, that freed his eyes to see something. So he was developing, and he was finding what his subject is, the same way a singer finds his voice, I think. And it was a very slow process, which was brutally interrupted just as it was beginning to kind of coalesce when he left in 1939. It was a decade, a very sterile decade that followed in terms of painting. He painted one painting in Baghdad that remains a landscape of a street scene in Baghdad. But primarily he was reduced to pen and pencil and paper. And he made enormous use of that. And I think the lack of paint enabled him to embody what for him had always been the ideal that Cézanne determined, was that you should draw with color, draw directly with color, rather than draw with line and then paint in with color. And this is what all of those 10 years of drawing enabled him to see, the confidence that he could have, that he could ultimately, when he got back to paint, he could just jump in and paint directly with the color. And that's in the 50s when his work really begins to take off. I think he was at that point not so much concerned about the quality of the work as it was the subject of the work. What was he being called to paint? And this brings up another part of the question that you had, was how does a painter determine what it is that his subject is? And it took a very long time for Czapski to find this, but it was ongoing and all the time. And it was about the doubt that he had internally that he would try one subject after another. But I think that you're correct in saying that as he got older, the forces began to come together in him. And he somehow, I think with the beginning of the loss of sight, when he turned 80, the 15 years at the end of his life were the most remarkable late flowering of painting that I can imagine, because not only was it a maturing of a vision, but it was really the beginning of confidence as a painter. And the body of work from 1980 to 1990 is both massive and empowered. And as I said about Edward Said saying that it is a late style that has to do with commitment to art rather than reality. And so he was able to give up the things that had held him back before about naturalism or about vision, and just to embody the paint and to become a painter.
Yeah, I mean, he was a man who had a lot of reality to give up.
Great deal. And that's also part of your question is, what about the camps and how did that impact him? I think he was determined not to become a chronicler in paint of those years. And I think he unfortunately was in a position where he had to become a chronicler in words, in literary form, but he was determined not to make that the subject of his paintings. And that was part of a duality that existed in him for a long time. And it took him a very long time to honor the ability to paint from within himself, somehow not being selfishly self-absorbed, which he could not afford to be otherwise.
Yeah. And so we in our class, we now do have some nice questions from students that I'm going to serve up. But in our class, we're reading a bit of Inhuman Land, as you know. And having read the correspondence between him and Herring, it's very clear just how much he suffered. Like it was obviously difficult to return to the period, but he wasn't a writer. He didn't see himself as a writer. I mean, he was a wonderful writer, but he didn't see himself as a writer. It was hard for him. It was difficult for him. He felt that, like, as you suggest, like this was the wrong genre. Somehow he was in the wrong artistic orbit. This was not what he was meant to be doing. And the product, the Inhuman Land book, is a result of such struggle, not just struggle because of the substance, but also struggle because of the form. And that doesn't come through. But like that it even exists is a kind of testimony to his determination, which also comes out in the ability to just keep painting decade after decade after decade after decade after decade. I'm going to give the floor. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I meant to say that he writes very clearly like a painter.
Yeah.
That's very good. But he was determined not to paint like a writer.
Yeah. Yes, that's beautiful. Okay, I'm going to give the floor now to our students. One of our students begins with actually a classic question, and one on which my own perspective has changed, partly thanks to your work. One of our students asked, is Czapski remembered as the historical figure, as the chronicler, as the survivor, or is he remembered as the artist? And I think part of the question is, should he be remembered as the historical figure, or should he be remembered as the artist?
It's a very complicated question, a very good question. It depends upon who's doing the remembering.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I first went to Poland to begin researching this in 2013, people in Poland were not really aware of Czapski as anything but a historical figure. He was known as the survivor of Katyn. He was the one who carried the torch. If anything, he was admired for his what seemed to be his national pride, which was not at all how he really experienced his life. My in those years since then, I think what I've been able to find is a greater interest in his work as a painter, because in Poland, the standards of the visual arts are very much controlled by the past, by the relation to the past. There's an enormously freeing and powerful graphic arts part of Polish art world. But the painting itself is very much not unlike what Czapski faced when he was in the academy in the 20s. There is this tradition, and then there's the kind of fashionable. And Czapski seems somehow now to speak to people more directly because of his individualism, which was considered a weakness earlier on, but it's now considered a strength. So I do think that Czapski is an exceptional painter. I'm not making a case for him being a great painter. For me, his life, his devotion to painting is really what's key. I don't think you can put him on a platform with, there are many great painters. There's a question here also of market. There's no real market value for Czapski. So it's very hard to assess him in terms of his greatness, because in the current art world, greatness is predicated upon auction prices. And Czapski certainly doesn't appear in the stratosphere that way, whereas his work represents a certain accomplishment that I find very inspiring and very meaningful. And I think more and more young people are beginning to recognize his work and gravitate towards it.
The next question I want to ask you from a second student, I'm going to ask it in her words, because I think she's onto something which is very important, and it complements what we were just talking about. During his time in imprisonment, Czapski experienced absence in a profound way. The men he saw one day were gone the next. In what ways do you think that his exposure to systemic loss or removal inform his artistic style, specifically his fixation on the subject?
On the subject?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Czapski's mother died when he was 6. And the sensation of loss is something that he's known his entire life. I think that it informs everything in an aesthetic sense with him, that the idea of absence and presence, that dichotomy, that kind of attempt to show the unseen, all of those revolve around this tentative relationship to the world around us. I think he is profoundly immersed in a world of loss. And his role, his life work is to not be, like Ludwig Herring, not to be eclipsed by that sense of loss, not to be crippled by it, but to understand it and to use it as a generative force.
Okay. Another student asks, much of Czapski's art seemed to center the act of looking, especially looking at art. Do the body languages and facial expressions of the figures in his paintings convey anything about his own attitude about looking critically or looking closely?
Well, I think that it became a subject for him is clear that, yes, it was very important to him, and it tells a great deal about his involvement in that world. I think he celebrated the act of looking. The monograph that I put together of his work, I call An Apprenticeship of Looking, which was his term for what he didn't consider that he had a career as a painter. He never valued himself that highly. He always thought of it, what he called as an apprenticeship he had of looking. And Looking, as Edmond de Goncourt said, is the longest of all the apprenticeships in the art. And that's really very true. So this is what he is, he's again, celebrating this idea of the engagement of a viewer with the work of art. And also his opportunity to have that time not just lost in the contemplation of a work of art. He wanted to keep it active, so he would step back from the painting and see the room that he was in, see the gallery, see the people who were involved also.
We some of the remaining questions are on overlapping themes, and some of them I think we can best address in class tomorrow. And we have made you work not for 90 years, but for at least for 90 minutes, which is a good chunk of time. I want to thank you again, Eric, for first of all, for all of the work you have done to bring Czapski to the world. You have begun a renewal, which I hope will continue. And I hope this lecture and this class will do something towards bringing his way of looking at things that everyone should care about closer to the center of conversations. I want to thank you for entertaining the questions of our class. I want to thank students for engaging with this difficult material after their previous difficult material, and for being with us. And I want to thank all of our guests, for our numerous guests, for joining us in this Franke lecture. So I'm Timothy Snyder. We've been listening to Eric Karpeles, and I'm very pleased, very happy that we could bring all of this together in the framework of the Franke lectures and the framework of this class. So thank you again, Eric.
Thank you very much to everyone involved, and I respect and appreciate the work that's being done by you and the class and the idea of bringing this material to a bigger world and a deeper understanding of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.